Are we nearly there yet? We're there. I too would like to thank my brother punk rock monk from Kaisersberg for giving us such an illuminating talk this afternoon. And please, Brother Thomas, give my greetings to the community at Kaisersberg and also to St Willibrod's in Düsseldorf as well. When I began my research into the relationship between monasticism and modernity, it was decided that I'd focus on the values and practices of what seemed to be two very different cultures. So instead of looking at the beliefs or worldviews of the monastery on the one hand and contemporary society on the other, this approach set out to examine what those who live these very different forms of life, as Professor Kratier was talking about, what these people value and do. So I want to begin by giving some idea of the values and practices that might have been around at the time when Loretta came to St Stephen's and became an anchoress. The century leading up to Loretta's enclosure saw a massive extension to the Norman building programme with the great Cistercian abbeys such as Furness, founded in 1123, Rivaux, founded in 1130, Fountains, 1132, and Byland in 1135. These abbeys being built in reaction, I think, to the older Benedictine establishments that had dominated the English monastic landscape for quite a while. Monasteries that you could say become associated with worldly corruption. The Cistercians built nearly 90 monasteries in Britain between the 12th and 15th centuries. Quite an impressive programme for the time. Monasticism was a very powerful force in Christendom at the time, as we know from the life at Christ Church Abbey, perhaps better known as Canterbury Cathedral. Many monasteries were associated with feudal and royal power. Christ Church Abbey had been extended and given a new prominence by 1126. We know that it had stables, granaries, barns, a bakehouse, brew house, laundries and a pauper hospital, thus perhaps making it a settlement in its own right. These were the centuries when there was a fierce struggle between the church, the monarchs and the feudal barons for power. And although some, like Ralph Neville, who was elected Archbishop of Canterbury in succession to Stephen Langton, who were enthralled to kings and nobles, many were not. Thomas Becket, of course, was martyred in 1170, just 50 years before Loretta arrived here at St Stephen's. And indeed, she and the Langtons had been exiled to Paris as a result of the conflict between King John and the church and barons. Simon Langton said of Ralph Neville that he was more courtier than priest. And that, I think, highlights one of the clashes of value at the heart of late medieval life. On the one hand, there was the culture associated with feudal power, with its valuing of accumulated wealth, knightly splendour, and its love of ornamentation and decoration. But on the other was a counterculture, searching for a rather simpler and more authentic Christianity. Now, in some ways, you could say that that clash is still with us. The clash between the culture of excess and unrestricted accumulation of power and a counterculture that's looking for more equality, sustainability and fairness. And I think the difference perhaps now is that the church isn't playing on both sides, and I'll return to that later. Believe it or not, the Cistercian Reform, with its huge abbeys at Citeaux and Clairvaux, as well as its English abbeys, was designed to be a return to simplicity and a more authentic Christianity. A Christianity less allied with power than its predecessor, the Cluniac Benedictine Reform. The abbey churches were simply decorated, and their high vaulted ceilings, of course, were meant to direct the eye and the heart away from this world towards the transcendent. Bernard of Clairvaux and Aelred of Rievaulx, perhaps the two most well-known Cistercian reformers, stressed the values of love and friendship over the more authoritarian values of the Benedictine tradition. And Aelred's De Spirituali Amicitia was one of the most popular spiritual treatises of the time. That softer spirituality and the values of simplicity and authenticity, I think, had captured the popular imagination by Loretta's time. The Franciscan Order, founded in 1209, and the Dominican Order that followed close on its heels in 1216. And we must remember that Thomas Aquinas was teaching in Paris as Loretta sat in her anchor hold here at St Stephen's. Loretta, with the Langtons, of course, had been responsible for bringing the Franciscans to Canterbury. But the focus of all this was on the values of simplicity, poverty, personal devotion, and loyalty to the Pope and the Church. And it must have been what partly fueled Loretta's desire to serve the Church in that distinctive vocation of an anchoress. Although Benedict praised the eremitic life for those who were spiritually advanced, his own call, and the call of his rule, was to the cenobitic life, the monastic life of balance between individual cell and the corporate word of God. And he perhaps gave more value to communal devotion than personal devotion. Now, I think it's possible that the Franciscan and Dominican focus on personal devotion undermined that corporate Benedictine vision of Christianity, and that maybe it represented one of the steps along the road to modern individualism. But the anchorite movement is as little like modern individualism as it is like the flight into the desert of the hermits or the wandering life of the mendicants. Anchorites and anchoresses took a vow of stability to place and lived a life of uncompromising enclosure, often within cells attached to churches, of which, incidentally, the anchorite cell in Holy Trinity Skipton, and I only discovered this a couple of days ago. There's an anchorite cell in Holy Trinity Skipton. It's a good example. The cell predates the present church. And then also, incidentally, Aelred, although he was a Cistercian, wrote an anchorite rule for his sister around 1160 to 62, known as De Institutione Inclusarum. I think it's interesting to see how the values of the Cistercians as representatives of that Benedictine monastic tradition and the mendicants, the Franciscans and Dominicans, compare. Whilst both the Cistercians and mendicants valued simplicity, for the Cistercians, decoration and images were out. St Bernard, we're told, was a fierce opponent of images. Whereas for Franciscans, images such as the crucifix, the crib, and Stations of the Cross formed a central part of their devotion. And as you know, the crib and the Stations of the Cross were Franciscan introductions into the life of the Church. The Cistercians were committed to the principle of self-sustaining community, and they promoted innovation and experimentation in agriculture and animal husbandry. The Cistercians are particularly celebrated for their innovations in hydraulic technology, the use of water wheels, for instance, and for conservation, especially of forests. The mendicants, by contrast, focused on urban mission and the preaching of the word. The Dominicans have been styled the Order of Preachers, and the Franciscans claim to have a special vocation to serve the poor. And although Francis's name has come to be associated with the care of animals, the mendicants were usually associated with urban life rather than with the rural life of the monasteries. Interestingly, many of the groups that claim to be new monastic, I think, take their values from the mendicants, claiming that mission to the urban poor and living a simple lifestyle define their monastic vocation. And I'll say something later about that as and about the new monastic mixing of traditions, Benedictine, Franciscan and Ignatian. But I want to turn now to the contrast between monastic values and practices and contemporary values and practices. We're trying to find a way to describe this contrast between the values and practices of monasticism and modernity. I had to be highly selective in the choice of representative values and practices. So, for instance, with regard to modernity, I think modernity is all about the values of freedom, stimulation, distraction, flourishing, progress or change, and environmental concern and individuality. The monastic life, by contrast, is characterized by the values of obedience, humility, stability, spiritual transformation, and the common life. Values which have been challenged in modern times, which monastics, both new and old, have had to adapt to fit the changed circumstances in which we live. And a similar picture emerged when describing the contrast between the practices of the different cultures. Modernities characterized by the practices of trying to be happy, by personal satisfaction, personal fulfillment, being entertained, self-improvement and the pursuit of skills. But monastic life is characterized by a longing for the divine, by asceticism, care, service, ordered prayer, spiritual discipline and learning. Practices that involve a focus that's not on the self and not on individual satisfaction. I think the contrast can best be described by saying that modern life centres around the self and its needs, whereas monastic life is focused on the other, whether that other be the divine or the community. Coming back to Loretta, although the anchoress life was, in one sense, a rejection of communal devotion, nevertheless, it remained connected to the life of the Christian community through the daily hearing of Mass and offices through the cell window and through contact with penitents and inquirers. It said of Loretta that she remained a confidant to the king as well as to the Langtons. And that despite being walled up in a cell adjoining the church, her focus would have centred on serving God and his people, not on her own needs and development. I think in that sense, Loretta was very much a product of the spirituality that is associated with monasticism, a spirituality that was prepared to give up the privileges and pleasures of this life in order to devote itself entirely to the life of prayer and the service of God's people. Poverty and simplicity of life, I think, would have been seen as necessary aspects of the life of obedience to God and to the Pope and his delegated representatives by those in touch with the new values of the Cistercians and Mendicants, even if many of those in power in the church retained their extraordinary wealth and privileges. Even as Loretta was living in her anchor hold, Simon Langton would have been living in his archdiaconal palace next door, just a few yards away, whilst his brother Stephen would have been living in the archbishop's palaces, of which there were several. Those Christians like the Langtons who admired the Franciscans and their vows of poverty, chastity and obedience were often amongst the wealthiest people in the country. Some suggest that the Langtons were the third wealthiest family in England at the time. One of the accusations brought against monasticism throughout the Middle Ages is that it was too associated with power, wealth and influence. And the aloofness and sense of superiority that derived from that wealth and power continue to be a problem. The recent child abuse inquiry found, when investigating the communities, the Benedictine communities at Ealing, Ampleforth and Downside, that they faced that sense of superiority, that somehow these monasteries were above the normal cut. And yes, continues to be a problem for the church more generally, which is often seen to be aloof and lacking in humility. So the quest for authenticity, for a simpler, humbler and more devoted Christian life, what Archbishop Stephen Cottrell has described as a simpler, humbler, bolder church in his recent strategy document for the Church of England, has been the motivating force behind many Christian reform movements. The anchorites, like the Franciscans and Dominicans, I think represent just a small fraction of those Christian groups that have attempted to recover a Christianity closer to that which is described in the Gospels. A version that pits itself, if you like, against the kind of Christianity allied with imperial glory and power. And interestingly, I think you can see Benedict's retreat from Rome and his founding of the monasteries at Subiaco and Monte Cassino might have been just one of those attempts to live a simpler, humbler, more devoted Christianity than that which he found in imperial Rome. That's certainly one way also of reading his little rule for beginners in what he calls the service of the School for the Lord's Service. But despite that drive for a simpler, humbler, bolder Christianity, the influence of various reform movements to achieve that, whether they be monastic or mendicant, Catholic, Protestant or charismatic, whether they be ecclesial or non-ecclesial, that influence has waned, and the numbers of lifelong vowed members of Christian communities has fallen dramatically. Christian communities are now a small proportion of what they used to be. Although there's been much interest in the phenomenon known as new monasticism over the last 15 years or so, most religious communities are a shadow of their former selves. Now, this is not the place to discuss whether new monasticism is a singular or a plural phenomenon, but I want to move on to talk about two extremes of the new monasticism, to reflect on how a culture that once focused itself entirely on the other, the divine, the presence of God in the Christian community, how that's adapting to cope with the stresses of modernity on the self, the individual, and human need. So when one end of this new monastic spectrum are those communities that are superficially modelled on the traditional monastic house. And I say superficial for reasons that I'll come to in a moment. But these are communities like the community of St Anselm that live a common life under a common rule, that are centred around a liturgical pattern of prayer and spiritual reflection, and that dress in a way that's recognisably religious. The St Anselm community has a special charism to pray for the Archbishop of Canterbury in his work, and the young people of that community reside at Lambeth Palace, forming a kind of spiritual powerhouse at the heart of the Church of England and the Anglican Communion. Now, the resemblance of that community to traditional monastic communities is, I think, relatively superficial, for commitment to that community lasts for no more than 1 year for most members, 2 in exceptional cases. And it's not the lifelong commitment of traditional monasticism. The community, unlike traditional communities, is comprised of men and women who live together. They're under 35 years of age, and they pay for the experience of what's called a year of transformation. £25,000 for those who are on the immersive path, and £3,600 for those on the integrated path. A year that involves them sharing together in prayer, study and service. Now, I have to admit that the community's rule of life doesn't claim to be only Benedictine. It claims to be based on what's best in the Benedictine, Franciscan and Ignatian traditions. And it claims to maintain a balance between the shared needs of the community and the needs of the individual. But of course it doesn't require that total commitment of the traditional Benedictine rule, which prescribes obedience, conversion of life, including the giving up of all possessions and stability. Although this community and many others like it claim to be monastic, in some ways they seem to be more like committed oblate, companion or third order communities than communities that follow a traditional monastic rule. In my research, I posed the question as to whether the definition of monasticism as a total and lifelong commitment to living in community dedicated to the service of God needs to be revised or at least revisited in view of the fact that now many churches have accepted that these new monastic groups, especially of the kind represented by the St Anselm community, are accorded status as the status of legitimacy, legitimate expressions of monasticism. Well, at the other end of the spectrum to those communities, the ones that share a common rule and a common life, are the communities known as monasteries without walls. For those who are not familiar with the term, it was first used by the Benedictine monk, John Main, who founded, together with another Benedictine, Lawrence Freeman, what has since become the World Community of for Christian Meditation. The inspiration for these monastic communities without walls goes back to people like the Benedictine Bede Griffiths, who was experimenting with interfaith monasticism in India in the middle of last century, and Raymond de Panikkar, a Roman Catholic priest and academic, who also committed himself to interfaith dialogue, and it was his idea of the universal monk, or the monk within, that's become an influential idea with new monastic communities. Now, I've singled out the Caris Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality as one example of this kind of community, because it might represent the most extreme version of a monastery without walls. Founded by someone who's now an Anglican priest, Adam Booker, and fellow traveller Rory McKenty in the early 2000s. The foundation argues that the call to monasticism is a universal call that equates simply to the contemplative or spiritual life. This kind of new monasticism draws on all religious traditions, and in fact, non-religious traditions at all. What might be called pagan or New Age spiritualities. And it advocates a wide range of spiritual practices, basically anything at all that will assist the individual in finding spiritual fulfillment and enlightenment. There's a bit of me that wants to call it hippie or New Age monasticism. But it has some learned followers, including the feminist theologian Beverly Lancetter. She's a Roman Catholic. She adopts, in many places, the language of spiritualism. And she speaks about this kind of monasticism as a via feminina, which perhaps ties it in a little with what Sarah was saying earlier. Whilst I can understand the focus on contemplation as a foundation of monastic life, traditionally, contemplative prayer hasn't been the most important focus of monasticism. That's been the common rule and the common life. This interreligious kind of new monasticism, however, advocates individuals writing their own rules and living out their own spiritual vocations. You could say it's a far cry from traditional monasticism, even if it tries to address some of the questions that have plagued the modern church, such as Christian uniqueness, the inadequacy of traditional religious language to describe religious experience, and the questions raised for religious belief by modern science. One of the shifts in modern Christianity in general, and reflected in the life of most new monastic communities, from Iona to Taizé, from Northumberland to the Tree of Life community in Leicester, from Moot in London to the Scargill community in North Yorkshire, is a shift from concentration on the divine life, the service of the Lord, that life beyond, to the life of this world and its needs. Most Christian communities now engage in some sort of service to the poor and needy, and that's seen as the primary focus of many new monastic communities, especially those like Sant'Egidio in Rome and Rutber House in North Carolina. Prayer might form part of their work, but the focus is on serving human needs and concerns such as drug addiction, homelessness, and poverty. Some, like the Iona community, have developed it further into political action and campaigning. And even some traditional monastics, such as Sister Joan Chichester, which I'm sure most of you know, have become involved in politically motivated advocacy, in her case for prisoners incarcerated in American penal institutions. It's been called the this worldly turn. And some of this shift of focus might be traced back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his idea of worldly Christianity and what he called a this worldly monasticism. In a sense, it represents the opposite extreme to that we find in Loretta and her fellow anchorites. They committed themselves to a life focused on the divine, what the learned Benedictine scholar Jean Leclerc called the desire for God, which, as he said, for traditional Benedictines went along with the love of learning. I'm not sure whether one could say that the desire for God or a focus on the divine, the holy, the transcendent is the chief motivating factor in many new monastic communities. So what then are we to make of these reflections on monasticism old and new? Have I run over time? Is monasticism changing to reflect the needs of our times? And is it being called to a new vocation to serve the world? Or does our time need the example of traditional monasticism and religious life to point to things that are appropriate for every age, the quest for the transcendent, the eternal and the unchanging? I'm going to wrap it up in actual fact. But I wanted to talk about the importance of place. Even in ruins, a medieval abbey acts as a witness to prayer and the Opus Dei. Monastic ruins, as well as living monasteries, witness to the importance of place in finding peace, quiet, and the presence of God. Contrary to the beliefs of some new monastics, monasteries matter, just as parish churches matter, especially when graced by powerhouses of prayer like the cells of anchorites. Monastic and ecclesial places draw people toward the transcendent and stand as witness to that different life or different culture mentioned earlier. So I wonder, as I wrap this up, whether we need to re-examine the question of whether the this worldly turn of the new monastics and the church in recent times can be associated with the decline of the churches. Whether a recovery of that otherworldly turn of monastics, anchorites, and others like Loretta would set us back on the path to recovery. I pose it as a question. I don't know the answer, but I think it's an opener for some kind of discussion. Thank you.